Okay, hi. So second part of this week's lecture, we're looking at ground-up placemaking uh, approaches, and this is explored in contrast to what we covered in the last recorded lecture that tends to look at top-down types of approaches. So the ground-up placemaking approaches tend to avoid the one model fits all attitude. Rather, it takes on less as it takes on less of a planner vision uh, and seek out for opportunity to customize more targeted solution. In this sense, it tends to be more inclusive and often involves various stakeholders, including local councils, community groups, business union, grassroots organizations, and with creative practitioners. Uh, One thing to remember about ground-up placemaking initiatives is that it invests a lot more in consultative, dialogue-centered, and participatory processes. While these may be slower, they often result in greater sense of community building effort that result in also a stronger sense of local citizenship. Citizenship is not here defined on legal terms, but rather as a concept where one feels that he or she is accepted by a local community uh, as a result of his or her contribution uh, to the development of a place. So design and creativity very often are included as part of the process of ground-up placemaking. Uh, uh, Rather than seen as a kind of product. So instead of seeing art as something that you commission an artist to produce in order to prettify or beautify a part or a space, uh, artists are actually invited to be part of the discussion process and to contribute their design and creative skill into finding solutions uh, to address the issue that the placemaking research project aims to address. So methodologically, in the sense, when we think of critical heritage studies, alongside a more ground-up approach to placemaking, this actually pushes us to think about how we narrate our history, right? Typically, the prevailing tendency is to regard historical change as a series of linear, eventful social, cultural processes that can then be categorized and divided into time periods uh, that are then neatly uh, plotted along a horizontal bar called a timeline, right? But the anthropologist Clifford Geertz suggests that a complementary model uh, might actually reflect many other situations a lot more accurately, especially when textual records are not always complete or precise. So even in a colonial town like Penang, say Penang, when the colonial record itself is very extensive, very often you also find there are a lot of things that are not recorded in textual forms. And therefore, we have to rely on oral history as a method in order to uh, recover or retain specific kinds of like voices and perspectives that are not found in the colonial archive. Instead of thinking of the timeline as a principal way to frame or structure one's history, Geertz instead proposed that historical change as a process can perhaps better be understood as a very slow and patterned alteration uh, that responds to the formal and structural patterns of cumulative activity. Now, what do these terms mean? Uh, what he's suggesting is that perhaps in order to gain a better understanding of the cultural landscape of a place, one has to start to learn how to identify uh, the, the, the shifts that are taking place in the landscape itself. The challenge here is to gain interpretive confidence and also to provide the kind of nuanced reading that sometimes we find it challenging to achieve, right? Yet suggests that the only way to do this is by cultivating ethnographic sensitivity so that we are able to understand change from a local perspective. What is ethnographic sensitivity here? I think it depends on who you speak to. To an anthropologist, this means actually sort of like going and stay with the community, learning the language, and really embedding yourself in the community so that you are able to understand the kinds of interpretive nuances of how they sort of like see the world and how they sort of like interpret the actions. But for cultural workers, this is not often always the best course of action, right? And over time, cultural workers have sort of like developed various methodologies that have loosely been defined under the term cultural mapping. So remember, cultural mapping is not a fixed sort of like, set of defined tool, set of things that you have to do in order to map the space. Rather, it's a sort of like procedure or a process to create a visualized database. So what is it then? So a culture map begins by identifying the cultural resources of a community and building and maintain a comprehensive database that helps organize and communicate that information to a wider public. Eventually, they can develop or establish necessary heritage conservation councils or bodies which will lead the conservation efforts, as well as develop policies and guidelines for safeguarding the cultural heritage of the community. So in large part, the aim, the biggest goal of cultural mapping is really has the end view of mobilizing the community member in the conservation and safeguarding of their shared cultural resources and heritage. But more importantly, what it does, it locates the local perspective of space and prioritizes and privileges this at the center of how we read and understand the map. So, for example, in this project done by Arts at Penang, it's a public housing sort of like flat neighborhood where the cultural workers work with the kids in the neighborhood in order to sort of like map out the surrounding in the sense of like, where is a safe space, where they feel it's unclean, where they feel it's unsafe, and where do they like to spend most of their time at, in order to sort of like get a sense of the geography from their perspective. Now, a town planner might have sort of like envisioned the space entirely different, with an entire different sort of like aim in mind. He or she might have thought that this would be the main playground where people congregate in. Whereas, as it turns out, for some reason or another, the kids found this a much more happy place to congregate around in. And so cultural mapping allowed for that sort of like local perspective to emerge and to initiate a kind of conversation to also sort of like find out how people find meaning within a particular site or space, right? So in this sense, cultural mapping can trigger a sense of active participation and a renewed and central role of the local players, recognizing the diversified set of goals and interests that emphasizes the value of place with multiple meanings, the cultural characters that inhabit it, alongside with the roots and narratives and stories that make it so rich, rather than merely the kind of economic potential of a place. Right? So all these things really help to sort of like shift our understanding of what urban planning is, and really our understanding of even a territory or place, focusing on different layers that give a place a meaning, right? So in this sense, I think what cultural sort of like mapping does, it helps to increase citizen participation and involvement in planning or formulation of that planning or policy, and greater attention to issues of cultural diversity and pluralism, and designing mechanisms to help to encourage and foster cultural diversity and pluralism of view. It also aims to broaden definitions of what culture is, and ultimately will also use this community cultural development as an integrating framework for linking what we normally think of as arts, heritage, and culture to issues that concern a community, a neighborhood, a society more broadly. So it recognizes very importantly that there is perhaps also a very important political dimension to art and culture and heritage. And in today's race for heritage listing and the measure of social, political, economic prestige that such listing might bring to our country, we often forget that there was a time when heritage work was actually civil society work. So when Penang Heritage Trust initiated the movement for Penang to be listed as the UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1998, it did so very strategically and perhaps naively, thinking that it might give some measure of protection to the historic city center in response to the passing of the Rent Control Repeal Act of 1997. And this had 28 months period to come into effect. The implication was that once the Rent Control Repeal Act of 1997 came into effect, it would cause a mass eviction of low-income tenants from the city center due to the overnight rental hikes. When the rent is not capped at a certain point, suddenly people cannot afford to live in the city anymore. The repercussion is that the outflow of long-term residents of Georgetown would contribute to the abandonment of all these shop houses, massive changes causing massive changes to the urban environment and the cultural ecology, and also at the same time resulting in shortage of affordable housing. At that time, UNESCO was very much something that is projected far ahead into the future. But Penang Heritage Trust started learning to write and speak in a global vocabulary of heritage. And this helped them to gain some ground. They work very actively at the local level with the Consumer Association of Penang to set up a property watch to monitor the prices and rents of decontrolled premises, and the work paid off. So in 1999, they were Georgetown Historic Enclave was listed as site number 50 in the World Monuments Watch 100 Most Endangered Sites of 2000. The listing helped to create greater public concern for the decay of the inner city and also concern for the survival of small businesses and culture in Penang. Now, this allowed Penang Heritage Trust to mobilize and lead public discussion for the postponement of the full rent control repeal to 2003. And over this period, they worked even harder to persuade the Penang state government to recognize the significance of Georgetown as a World Heritage Site, because state endorsement from both Penang government and the federal government was ultimately required to secure the nomination onto the UNESCO World Heritage Tentative List. So, since the federal government was already working on Malacca at that time, the outcome was that Penang and Malacca were jointly nominated for the 2008 listing. So, in this sense, heritage is, as much as anything, a political act. And we need to ask serious questions about the power relations that heritage has too often been invoked to sustain and to be spoken as part of this larger kind of like power, question of power. So ideas of nationalism, legacies of imperialism, justification of colonial rule, legitimization of cultural elitism, continued prioritization of Western superiority, cultural superiority, practices of social exclusion based on class and ethnicity, and the continued fetishization of expert knowledge have all exerted very strong influence on how heritage is used, defined, and managed. A cursory survey, however, of upcoming Critical Heritage Association conference papers might give you a flavor of the topics that are trying to sort of like challenge some of heritage strong ties with power and authority in all across the world. So topics instead are asking us to actually think of heritage through to redefine heritage along different ideas, right? So how do we sort of like, for example, there are collecting the pandemic, contested present, uncertain future. How do we think of collecting, archiving, and documenting personal experiences of the pandemic, given that social distancing and isolation has become the norm of how we live our lives today. So, and then there is also Archives Heritage Museum and the Black Lives Matter. So the Black Lives Matter movement was a movement that erupted earlier this year, cumulatively that has sort of like crystallized this year as a movement to sort of like seek social justice redress against institutionalized racism in the US and other sort of like Western countries. So very often archives, heritage practices and museums are seen as keepers of historical knowledge. How do these institutions, how can these institutions now then sort of like respond to growing calls to revisit a very sort of like painful an unsettling period of Western history, right? Modern history, especially when it's built on a history of subjugation of other people. And then there's also more whimsical and also quite actually interesting ways of thinking about contemporary forms of heritage. So like there's a paper from China called Our Factories on WeChat, Social Media and Heritage Discourses on Industrial Heritage in Zhengzhou. So I hope this gives you a sense of the possibilities of expanding the topic into arguments. Typically, at the very stage of a research proposal, development, students will come and say they want to work on this architecture or their artwork and reflect on a particular cultural identity they belong to. Developing a thesis needs to go beyond that very surface reading of what constitutes art and culture. And this is where theory comes in to help you reframe your topic by suggesting that the same topic can be explored and discussed from other perspectives and dimensions. Okay? So according to this, then really, I'm going to give you a few more examples of where we can really sort of like push how we think about heritage practice from various kinds of like political dimension. So take, for example, the Baku Dapan. It's a food studies collective in Yogyakarta. They believe that food is not merely about filling the stomach. And they're a study group where they really look at sort of like food, not just as from the lens of sort of like heritage or conventional sort of like ways in which we think about heritage, but they seek to develop new methods of inquiry and challenge the way we normally think about food studies by really sort of like finding methods and forms of presenting their research through arts, to daily life practices, to sort of blogging, writing and publishing. So what is touched on here is not, documenting what your mother's recipe is, because that's part of a very, that is necessarily part of their methodology. But at the same time, they're also sort of like locating and trying to understand how we can sort of like understand the history of a particular dish by connecting it to question of food security, sustainability, and global sort of like circulation of food products. So this then helps connect the study of food from a very microscopic and very personal sort of like level of taste or feeling of connection to home or belonging, to larger, more abstract sort of like issue of how ingredients that allows us to feel how we feel actually is part of a larger system of circulation and of possible exploitation that connects different types of like life, different types of world, different types of like culture in one singular global connected economy, right? So that's one sort of like interesting approach. Then there's also an attempts to then democratize heritage by consciously rejecting elite cultural narratives and embracing the heritage insights of people, communities, and cultures that have traditionally been marginalized in formulating heritage policy. So a lot of the recent initiatives have turned their attention to the cultures of the Orang Asli in Malaysia. So Gerai OA and Gerimis Art Project are two examples that I want to sort of highlight here. Gerai OA is interesting because it's not a social enterprise. So a social enterprise is a business run for profit that set aside specific portion of their earning to support a particular social issue or cause. Whereas this is entirely, Gerai OA is not a social project, it's an entirely volunteer-run nomadic store selling crafts made by the Orang Asal for indigenous minorities of Malaysia from across Borneo and Peninsular Malaysia, and with 100% of the sales being paid to the name artisan. So it's very important that all the works are created by someone that's attributed to a named person. They're not anonymous craftsmen. They're given, they're recognized as an artisan, as a craftsperson, and it's given this recognition through this process of a business transaction, right? But Gerimis is another organization started by a younger group of people who work very closely with various Orang Asli artists in collaborative art projects and archiving initiative in order to develop a much more public-facing, accessible online platform to communicate knowledge about the artistic life as well as the knowledge system of various Orang Asli communities in Malaysia. Rather than frame this as simply culture or spiritual beliefs, they recognize these as both artistic in nature, given that a lot of the craft and the artwork, the craft is imbued with a keen sense of artistic beauty, but also that whatever knowledge that they possess, the Orang Asli possess, is not just sort of like spiritual beliefs or superstition. They are actual knowledge systems, right? So these two initiatives then therefore show that there is interest to really sort of like push and go beyond how a government has defined heritage policy and what they choose to support by finding various ways to reject elite cultural narratives and embrace heritage insights of people, communities, and cultures that have been excluded from this mainstream narrative. Okay. Yeah, but the most important thing, I think, is really to think of, is an example that I want to point out to you from West Kalimantan. And this really takes cultural mapping to another level. Uh, uh, the, 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 the project is, described under the term counter mapping rather than cultural mapping. And what it does, it uses drone technology for a very interesting political purpose. So a village meeting was held, and and this came about because some of the villagers realized the possibilities of drone technology in creating counter mapping techniques, and decided to gather their friends to fund a mapping project by contributing a monthly by committing to a monthly contribution of 500,000 rupiah, or around 50 USD, from each sub-village to set up an institute called the Sondiri Institute, where they run a drone school in West Kalimantan, where this is where civil society organizations and community activists who are interested in learning and using drone technology to map could join and participate. So what happens is that when they gain this skill, drone allows them for counter maps to be produced, to provide evidence against mining companies, but also to support local community efforts to protect their existing lands and forests. Right, so maps made by drones then are sort of like used because they are able to provide high quality data that the satellites imagery are not able to sort of like capture. So the land use planning maps were made on the basis of satellite maps. Many of the small villages were not visible in the process. They were not able to sort of like, claim the land rights when they're sort of like challenged by all these larger companies encroaching on their territories. With the higher resolution drone maps, however, residential areas, farming, fruit trees, forests, and other long-term users of the land are made visible and supplied as evidence. So this allows the villagers to reclaim those residential areas that are now officially part of many of these sort of like multi-corporation companies' concession, where they sort of like slowly inch into your territory. And these are maps then used for their argument in court to halt the concessions for mining and for oil palm. So to go beyond cultural mapping into counter mapping forms of knowledge, what I hope to highlight is really when you look at what mapping is that it can be understood also as a political process rather than merely a technical tool. Mapping is not only an act of how to produce maps, it is importantly always asking who produces the map, how people can access the maps, who can read and interpret the map, and how the map can be used to subjugate people, but also how can a counter map be produced in order to liberate a community from those systems of mapping oppression.